Men heute ans Suecia Spakwas, Hasquails Titstes, Hachtensquan, Eicht, Noya Matrix, Hoichich Che Siam, Hoichich Hotens Behaim, Hoichich Tishet Mail. So on behalf of the Squamish Nation, I'd like to welcome you to our territory. The village that you are on is called Chachai. Can you say that? Chachai. And that means place of herring. So all this herring was here at Horseshoe Bay at one time. Just kidding. My English name is Alice Gus. My ancestral name is Suecia, and I also carry Spakwas, and I live in the village called Stotmas, and Stotmas is one of our oldest villages of the Squamish Nation. Who can guess how old our village is? I know some of you know. Take a guess.
14,000 years.
No. What about on this side? Someone on this side?
8,000.
8,000? 14,000? Don't you just love the prices right? Just kidding. Our village is known to be over 12,000 years old. They did an archaeological dig in the 1970s just across the street from where I presently live. So I'm going to sing this song. It's Chief Jimmy's song. And usually when you guys are welcome to this beautiful building and this beautiful territory on this beautiful night, we like to welcome each and every one of you to our territory. But because of that, I don't know where all your nations are. Just kidding. I am going to get you guys to represent animal nations. So on this side over here, you guys are going to honor the Yoyos. Can you say Yoyos? Yoyos is what came back into Howe Sound. What came back into Howe Sound? Yoyos. Absolutely. So when I say Yoyos, get up and dance, you guys are going to go ahead. I got a drum. You guys are going to represent the killer whales, our brothers and sisters, our swimmer brothers and sisters. And over here, you guys, I want you guys to represent the skeet lao. Can you say skeet lao? Skeet lao. That's because you guys are workaholics. Work, 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 work. Just kidding. Wow, you guys are a hard crowd. When I say ski low, get up and dance, you guys are going to stand up and you guys are going to pretend you're on a stick. You guys are going to represent the beaver nations. All you guys do is work, 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 work. So when I say ski low, get up, dance, you guys are going to pretend you're not on a stick, but don't forget to swing your hips. Woohoo! Okay, here we go.
Yo, yo, yo,
everybody go home now. Let's get it.
Oseam Tanoyap, Seam, Siayat, not also swore to Nachin Clawewa Kamocho Milk on an accent squallow. Kayachton, the Kai to milk, to Squamish or Stalmoch to milk. Chen Quanman Tommy up now at 8 great more. Teats eats. So, hello everybody, my name is Swotwo. Can you say that? Swotwo. So, Swotwo is my actual name. It's part of the Squamish language, or Snatchum. And it means cougar or mountain lion. I was born in November, which is when the cougars come down the mountain. That's why I was named Cougar by my mother. But my traditional name or my ancestral name is Chernaugton, and I'd personally like to welcome you here on behalf of our people to our land, the land of the Squamish people. As Zoysia just explained, we have been here for a very long time. My ancestors and all the way back 12,000 years, all the way up to today, we've always paddled through these waters of the House Sound or Salish Seas, up to Alaska, down to California. And I'd just like to thank you from the bottom of my heart to standing up for our people and our future to save these seas, because they're just starting to heal themselves now. And I would hate to see in the future that all the animals that are just coming back to be kicked out again by all that pollution. My people here, we still paddle on the waters today, and I'm hoping that my daughter of 2 months will be able to paddle on the waters when she's older as well, and I'll get to teach her. And when that day does come, I'll thank you again, raise my hands to you for fighting for our people, because now is a time of unity. You know, it's really going to take us all to be in Chotmoch, to be one, to fight these people. Tell them they can go make money some other way, and some other, they don't have to kill our people, they don't have to kill our land to do that. So I would just like to share one more song. It's a journey song. It's a song that we sing when we're on the water. It goes to the beat that we paddle. So when we're paddling out in the water, I actually went up to Bella Bella last summer, and we went with our canoe families to something called Travel Journeys. And so we paddled from Squamish, just north a little bit, and we paddled from there all down to Bella Bella in our traditional canoes. It took us about 3 weeks of paddling to actually get there. We paddled for about 10 hours, 14 hours every day. It was a fun trip. And when we're on the canoe, 8 hours in, you get pretty tired. People might get a little bit grumpy. It's really hot in the middle of the summer. So to lift everybody's spirits up, we'll start singing this song. We have many songs, but this is one of the songs we sing on the canoe to keep our spirits going. It keeps everybody in time, and it really lifts our spirits up. So I'd just like to share this song with you. We would like to share this song with you. It's our paddle song from Noel Natrero, who owns the paddle song now. Go see him. And once again, before I head off, I'd just like to thank you and welcome you to our territories of the Squamish people and let you know that the Squamish Nation, our people will always be here right behind you and with you, standing with you to fight these people. And thank you once again for all the work you're doing here, the hot site SOP, all the good work. Osio.
Good evening, everyone. I just want to acknowledge Vanessa. Is she? Where are you? Oh, there you are. One of the organizers from My Sea to Sky, as well as our nation member, Crystal Lewis, who works with Sea to Sky. And she's one of our Squamish Nation youth. And Swoho is one of our ambassadors.
Kai, I work with Dogwood Initiative, and it's our mandate to bring together everyday British Columbians to take back decision-making power. And I think that's what we're seeing in this room tonight. When you have grassroots and elected members of both First Nations governments, municipal governments, and you bring those two communities together in the same canoe, pulling in the same direction, some incredible things can happen. So thank you all for coming out tonight. As you know, the provincial government has staked its political future on an LNG industry that they claim will bring in $100 billion in revenues, create tens of thousands of jobs. And at the same time, the federal government just got back from Paris, where they signed on to the Paris COP21 climate agreement, where they agreed to take aggressive action to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. So we're going to try to reconcile those two things tonight, and we have a couple of folks, both an economist and a scientist here, who are going to help us through some of the tough questions brought up by what look like competing priorities from two different levels of government and the people in this room. So first, I want to bring up David Hughes. He's been studying natural resources, energy resources in this country for 40 years, 32 years with the Geological Survey of Canada, a fellow with the Post-Carbon Institute. He's going to speak first, and then I'll introduce Marc Lee. So please welcome David Hughes.
It's not all myths. There's some realities here that we clearly need to look at. So what I'd like to just give you a few slides worth of global context on energy use. How much energy do we use in the world? Where does it come from? The NEB came out with some recent gas supplies about 2 weeks ago. And the whole issue of future energy security. Do we really want to get rid of all of these non-renewables resources as quickly as we can? The environmental impacts of producing the gas that will go into those LNG terminals, fracking, land use, greenhouse gas emissions, which we already heard alluded to. The economic viability, which Marc will speak more to, and implications for long-term energy sustainability. What does this do to compromise future energy security in Canada? If we look at the world, this is the last 50 years of consumption in the world. We can see, first of all, the consumption has more than tripled. Oil is the #1 source of energy in the world, followed by coal and gas. Together, those fossil fuels make up about 85% of the energy that we use. If you add in uranium from nuclear energy, 90% of the world is dependent on non-renewable energy resources. The balance being large hydro and non-hydro renewables, things like wind and solar and so forth. If we look at the forecast for the future, this is the Paris-based International Energy Agency. They're suggesting energy consumption will grow in the world by 35% through 2040. And fossil fuel will still be 74% of consumption by the time we get to 2040. Other renewables, and this includes things like burning wood for cooking and heat, will only be 19% globally by 2040. If we look at the year 2014, where did our energy come from in 2014? We can see oil #1, coal #2, gas #3, large hydro #4, followed by nuclear energy. Non-hydro renewables, things like wind, solar, biomass, and biofuels only made up 3% of global consumption in 2014, even though they've grown exponentially. If you look at the growth rate, quite a bit of those non-hydro renewables is biomass, burning wood for energy. If we look at per capita consumption of energy by country, we can see that Canada is close to the top of the heap. Canadians burn more, or use more energy per capita than the US. We use about 5 times the world average, and 12 times what people in India use. The problem being is that the industrialized world, Canada, the US, OECD countries, are declining slightly in their per capita consumption over the last 15 years. The developed world, China, India, and so forth, are growing very rapidly. So China averaged 7% growth in per capita energy consumption over the last 15 years. That's the problem, because the developing world is 80% of the world's population, and they aspire to much higher levels of consumption. If we look at Canada, 2014 in Canada, we can see that Canada is blessed with a lot of large hydro energy. So large hydro was really third in terms of energy consumption in Canada. If we look at non-hydro renewables, things like wind, solar, biomass, and biofuels, they only add up to 1.8% of Canadian consumption, even though they've grown exponentially over the last 21 years. If we look at natural gas, which is what we're talking about tonight, Canadians are very high per capita consumers of natural gas. We consume more gas per person than the US. We consume about 20 times as much gas per person as people in China, and we're about 10 times the world average. So Canadians are very large consumers of gas. If we look at the growth rates in the last 15 years, the industrialized world is growing very slowly in terms of increasing its consumption from already very high levels. But the non-industrialized, the developing world, China, India, are growing very, very rapidly. So China increased its natural gas consumption per person by 14% per year over the last 15 years. If we look at delivered energy, most renewables, things like hydro, wind, solar, generate electricity. But if we look at delivered energy, the form of energy that people actually use, in 2015, electricity was only 18% of the total. So that's the energy form that renewables largely contribute to. So we use an awful lot of fossil fuels, including a lot of natural gas, directly. Things like heating buildings, inputs to petrochemical processes, and so forth. If we look at how it was used, roughly a quarter of the energy that we use is for transportation, and half of it is for industrial uses. If we look at oil and gas in Canada, most of the oil and gas is in the east, or in the west, sorry, the 4 western provinces. Northeast BC, Alberta, Saskatchewan, and a little bit of Manitoba. There's roughly 800,000 wells that have been drilled since the 40s in Western Canada. About a little over 200,000 of those are still producing something. 25,000 of those were drilled in northeastern BC. If we look at natural gas production in Canada, we can see that it peaked in 2001. It's been declining since then, even though there was some very high gas prices back in 2006. It's gone up a little bit, largely because of the advent of hydraulic fracking, horizontal wells, and hydraulic fracturing. BC produced about 28% of Canada's gas in 2015. Alberta produced 68%. So most of our our oil and gas come from BC and Alberta. If we look at the latest, this is the latest off the BC LNG website, 20 proposed projects, 18 NEB export licenses. So the NEB has basically just approved every LNG proposal that comes across their desk, even though those add up to probably more than triple Canada's total production of gas. So obviously all those aren't going to get built. If we look at where they are, there's 15 of them in the north, many around Prince Rupert, 4 of them at Kitimat. And if we look at the southern proposals, there's 5 of them. 3 of them actually, this doesn't show the Malahat project, which is a quite recent one, but there's 5 of them here, including the Squamish proposal, which is quite a small one in terms of total annual volume of LNG proposed to be shipped out. And these 2 on the Vancouver Island, the 3 would require a major gas pipeline to deliver the gas from the mainland. There's also 5 pipelines proposed in the north to feed gas to those projects. If we add them all up, this column on the left-hand side is the total LNG trade in the world as of 2015, about 250 million tons of LNG per year. If you add up the output from the 20 proposals in BC, they add up to more than 300 million tons per annum. So obviously, we don't need to double the LNG capacity of the world. If we look at the actual scenarios, I wrote a report for the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives published last May. And these were the range of scenarios that I looked at. Basically, the BC government high scenario is 5 terminals. The low scenario is basically 1 terminal. And then 2, 3, and 4 terminals in between as scenarios. If we look at the National Energy Board's proposals and projections for future gas production by province, this was their 2013 projection. They suggested the only growth in gas production was going to be BC. BC was going to triple in gas production and comprise 61% of Canadian production by 2035. The rest of the provinces are basically in decline. They just came out with a new report 2 weeks ago, and this is what that looks like. All of a sudden, it looks like Alberta is not going to keep declining, it's going to go flat. BC is only going to double over that period, so they needed more gas and they got it in their reference case proposal. So just to flip back, you can see the difference in 3 years in terms of their projections for Canadian gas production. So they assumed in their latest projection that 23% more gas is going to be produced by 2035, and 37% fewer wells will be drilled. So those wells are going to be vastly more productive than their assumptions only 3 years ago. If we look at that compared to Canadian demand, this is the 2016 report that came out 2 weeks ago. We can see they're projecting Canadian domestic requirements will keep growing into the future for natural gas. They built in enough gas for 1 LNG export terminal into that case. And you can see in 2018, production is 38% higher in the report 2 weeks ago than it was 3 years ago. There's a lot of uncertainty in these forecasts. If we look at the BC NEB reference case 1 terminal, Canadian demand, this is what will be required to build 5 terminals, the BC government high case. So if 5 terminals get built, 47% of Canadian gas supply, or gas production, would be exported as LNG by 2040. So that's what it looks like when you put it all together. 102 trillion cubic feet exported by 2040 with 5 terminals. What would that look like if you believe the NED forecast? This is the difference between production and Canadian domestic demand. So that if we had no export terminals, we would have this much gas to export. If we build one terminal, we basically use up all of the difference between Canadian demand and production by 2040. If we build 2, Canada's in a deficit by 2020. If we build 5, Canada's in a deficit by 2017. And we're short about 75 trillion cubic feet of gas by 2040 in 5 trillion cubic feet. So if you believe the NED projections, Canada will become a major net importer of gas, likely from the eastern US by 2040. If you look at the purported recoverable resources that are published on a BC government website, they have a 2,900 trillion cubic feet of marketable reserves published on the ministry's, I think it's the Ministry of Natural Gas, Ministry of Industry, its website. If you look at the National Energy Board and the BC Oil and Gas Commission, it's about 435. So they're overstating the available recoverable resources by about 500%. And basically they're conflating in-place resources, every molecule in the ground, with what you can actually recover with existing technology. Reserves are estimates that are based on the drill bit, so they're much more certain. Resources are basically probabilistic estimates with very wide error bars. So if we just look at reserves, the reserves in 2014, the raw gas reserves were 51 TCF. The 5 LNG export terminals would export twice that. And then if we look at domestic requirements out of BC, so if we're going to build 5 LNG terminals plus 8 Canadian requirements, we're going to have to recover triple the proven reserves in 2014 in order to do that. Where will the gas come from? It turns out most of it will come from Western Alberta and Northeast BC. 2 big formations, the Montney Play and the Horn River Play, right up near the Northwest Territories border. The Duvernay, which is just starting to be developed in Alberta. If we look at, these are what I would consider realistic estimates of Canadian marketable gas resources, published by the National Energy Board. If we look at what's left, half of it is in one play, in the Montney Formation, if you believe that. 9% is in the Horn River, and in total, 88% is unconventional. So these are shale and tight gas sands that require horizontal drilling and fracking to really produce. If we look just at BC, this is what I would consider a reasonable estimate of remaining recoverable resources in BC. 94% is unconventional, so that would have to be recovered by horizontal drilling and hydraulic fracturing. 65% of that, 2/3 of it is in one play, the Montney. 19% in the Horn River. I've done a lot of work on U.S. shale plays, so I've looked at every U.S. play in the U.S., the major shale gas and shale oil plays. And it's been remarkable. The advent of horizontal drilling and hydraulic fracturing has really made U.S. gas production take off. So it's grown from essentially nothing in 2000 to more than half of U.S. supply, just in 15 years. A lot of it comes out of one play, the Marcellus in Pennsylvania and West Virginia. The Marcellus has peaked. In fact, all of these plays have peaked, except for the top three. Shale gas in the U.S. peaked in July 2015. Part of that is because of the price, the downturn in drilling. Part of that is just the nature of shale plays. Typically, they look like a bubble with a long trail in terms of production. Same thing will happen in Canada. The geology is different area, different age, but the geometry is the same. I developed what I consider to be the shale play life cycle by studying U.S. shale plays. Typically, there's discovery, followed by a drilling boom. Discovery is followed by leasing frenzy. The leases require so many wells in order to hold the leases. To have a drilling boom to find sweet spots, these plays are not uniform. They always have core areas, which are the most economic. Production rises very rapidly. Sweet spots become saturated with wells, and field production begins to decline. Plays like the Haynesville, which is in Louisiana, was unknown in 2007. It was the biggest shale play in the U.S. in 2012, and it's now down by 50%. So the Haynesville is really tells the tale of shale. It's a good example. Unknown, 2007, peaked in 2012. It's now down 46% below peak. I think it's actually down more than 50% now. So that's what we can expect, likely, in Canada, even though the Montney is a very big shale play by comparison to some of the places in the U.S. The advent of horizontal drilling, you can see it's basically just taken off. Back in 2000 to 2006, less than 10% of the wells were horizontal. The advent of fracking coupled with horizontal drilling just made drilling vertical wells totally uneconomic by comparison. So in 2014, 72% of all wells drilled in Canada were horizontal. 28% were more conventional vertical wells. So when it comes to fracking, the horse has left the barn. That really is the only way that makes sense going forward. You can look at BC. This is BC raw gas production by drill type, horizontal versus vertical in direction. 82% of BC gas was produced from horizontal wells in 2015. So there's no way we're going back. If we look at production by play, 64% is produced from those two plays I mentioned, the Horn River and the Montney. All of the other plays in BC are in decline. If we look at the nature of shale plays, just a couple slides here, to show you the difference between horizontal wells and vertical wells. So the bottom line is a vertical well average in the Montney. The purple line is a horizontal well average. So these wells produce 4 times as much gas when they first come online. The Horn River is a very prolific play, world-class play. Produces twice as much gas as a horizontal Montney well when it first comes online. But the catch is that they decline very quickly. The 3-year decline on a Horn River well is about 75%. On a Montney horizontal well is 71%. So you've got to keep drilling. The nature of shale plays is a drilling treadmill in order to offset the declines. If we look at what I call a field decline, which is a combination of old wells and new wells, this is what the Montney will look like if you stop drilling in 2014. So if you stop drilling, so this is all the gas produced from wells drilled prior to 2014, you can see that the first year decline if you stop drilling is 35%. So that's how much production you lose if you don't drill. So you have to keep drilling. That's the message. How many wells would you have to drill in order to meet the government's 5-terminal case? This is what it will look like in terms of the rate of drilling. So we have to go from about 400 wells now, basically quadruple that until we ramped up production high enough to meet the production level we needed, and then we could back off a bit and drill somewhere between 1,500 and 2,000 wells per year going forward. So by 2040, we would have drilled about 44,000 new wells, and that compares to the 25,000 that have been drilled in BC back until the 50s, basically. The different scenarios, BC government high case, the black is existing wells, 25,000. We need 43,773 new wells to meet the 5-terminal case. And even if we have no LNG terminals, just to produce the gas that we need for Canadian requirements, we're still going to need close to 14,000 new wells. So the concept that the oil and gas industry is going to go away if we don't export this gas is not true. And the industry is going to be here for the long haul, just to meet our own requirements. Environmental impacts, land disturbance from the terminals and the pipelines needed to supply them, land disturbance associated with wells, pipelines, roads, and seismic activities, water consumption. The average Horn River well uses 25 million US gallons, and a Motley well averages about 3.5 million gallons. That compares to an average US shale well of about 5 million gallons. Induced earthquakes are increasingly common. There's been several of them. I'll show you a map of that. Truck traffic, you need about 2,500 truck trips to service one Horn River well. Has done everything it set out to do to attract investment for the cleanest LNG in the world. Success is not for quitters. We must begin to export, or the 13,000 people who depend on this industry today will be out of work. And that's absolutely not true from what I told you as to how much drilling we're going to have to do just to keep our own requirements. The industry's not going away. Your government will establish a prosperity fund to leave it endowment and to pay down and eliminate the debt. So that hasn't gone away either. So just to summarize, oil and gas are likely to remain an important component of energy consumption for decades, given an energy density and utility for which there are few substitutes. Hydraulic fracturing of tight gas and shale gas has been a game changer, but its sustainability in the long term is questionable. And environmental impacts are a concern. This implies higher domestic prices down the road, which even further reduces any arbitrage between North American prices and European prices or world prices. Any beef forecasts are optimistic and indicate that even if BC production more than doubles, One LNG terminal would use up all Canadian export capacity by 2040. Developing 3 to 5 terminals would make Canada a major net importer of gas, unless production could be ramped up far higher than NEB projections. The BC government's claim of 2,900 trillion cubic feet of marketable gas reserves conflates in-place resources with recoverable resources. Remaining marketable resources are somewhere around 435 trillion cubic feet, and proven raw gas reserves are 51 trillion cubic feet, according to the BC Oil and Gas Commission and the National Energy Board. Claims that BC LNG will reduce global greenhouse gas emissions are not credible, given the full cycle emissions from the wellhead to the burner tip. Meeting Canada's Paris COP21 agreement will be extremely difficult, if not impossible, even given the Alberta cap on the oil sands, with the level of LNG development contemplated by the BC government. Canada's emissions outside of the oil and gas sector would have to contract 54% by 2030 from 2013 levels, and 52% between 2020 and 2030, given Environment Canada projections. Canada's de facto energy strategy is liquidating its finite, non-renewable resources as quickly as possible. These are strategic resources that will likely be needed domestically in the future. They come with extensive environmental impacts and deserve a longer-term plan for the sake of future generations and the environment. When you think of that old adage, I think it really does have a lot of importance even today. There's no such thing as a free lunch. Thank you very much.
David. As kind of, I've been leading up a climate justice project for the past 7 years at the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. That project is fundamentally about how we make the transition as an economy, as a society, to something close to zero carbon a few decades down the road. So we've spent a bunch of time looking at pathways to positive futures, how we can transform transportation or housing, and looking at things like green jobs. But in the past few years, we've spent a lot of time playing defense, arguing against dumb infrastructure projects, the Enbridge pipeline being one, and LNG being another. So we've been doing a series of reality checks on the claims that have been made for LNG. I think just as an opening comment, we are sort of in a very interesting moment in human history. Obviously, the ink on the Paris Agreement around climate change is barely dry, and we're in a bit of a limbo state right now. We're not quite sure what's going to happen because it's almost like we've evolved out of the kind of pure climate denial. No one's really rejecting the science of climate change anymore, unless you're competing for the nomination of the Republican Party. But notwithstanding that, in Canada, it's widely accepted there's the science, but we don't really want to change the way that we act a whole lot. So we're in this era where we have these sort of all of the above statements, where politicians will say, yes, I support these strong climate objectives, but I also want more oil and gas and pipelines and things like LNG. So it'll be an interesting time over the next month in particular, because we're anticipating our first ministers meeting in Vancouver in early March. And at that point, the new Prime Minister and the Premiers are to unveil this sort of new Canadian climate strategy. Even in some of the rumblings we're hearing around, and it's great that Canada was, an active player in the negotiations. They helped back this new global aspirational target of keeping global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. But at the same time, we hear all of this stuff about, well, we need to get pipelines for Alberta bitumen to Tidewater, whether that's Energy East or Kinder Morgan or Enbridge. And similarly, here in BC, we have a premier that brags about BC's climate record, all of the things her predecessor did. Gordon Campbell when he was Premier, and there are some good first steps in terms of climate, but our current Premier has done zero on the climate file. And at the same time as trying to take credit for actions around things like the carbon tax, we've actually seen greenhouse gas emissions increase every single year since 2010. We warned back in 2012 that if the BC government wanted to push ahead with this natural gas strategy and LNG, that it would be virtually impossible for the province to meet its greenhouse gas targets. And we were completely dismissed. Later on in access to information requests, we found the beer gas basically saying, yeah, they're actually right. But that didn't change the fundamental spin coming out of the provincial government. And I would actually argue further than that what we've seen from the BC government, the Premier and Natural Gas Minister, Richard Coleman, is a pattern of misinformation about this issue. So me as an economist, I always think about policy, and the decisions we have to make is they're always about choices, right? There are always going to be winners and losers, and good policy is about evaluating the benefits that you will get from moving forward and weighing those against the costs. And this is how we make good decision making. At least in my idealized world, I think I watched too much West Wing back in the 1990s or something. And instead, what you actually find is that a lot of this is just the kind of perpetual, spin machine. So when it came to the report that David did with us, one of the things the media picked up on was this finding that Canada could be a net importer of gas if BC got the plants and final investment decisions on these things. So we actually FOI recently, what the government's response to all of that was. And, they there's a whole interesting kind of communications going on within the bureaucracy and at the political level, coming up with messaging to, debunk what David said. And there was this really kind of nasty op-ed that, penned in the name of Gas Minister Richard Coleman, saying how, David's just completely wrong. And then you keep going through the files and you actually see correspondence from the civil servants who actually do all of the work on resources, and they basically say, well, we need to get communications to understand the difference between what David was playing earlier, the in-place resources versus marketable resources. So without actually coming out and admitting it publicly, we have in all of this correspondence, the reality that they actually know what these things are happening. So I think that there's basically five big whoppers, five untruths that the provincial government keeps repeating ad nauseum, and by doing so, I think they feel that this will become their own truth. They've actually constructed their own narrative about what this industry will do, and none of it is really based on any proof. It's all just kind of stuff that they throw out there and repeat over and over in speeches. So what are those five things? One is that BC has 150 years worth of gas supply. So David took this on in his talk. Again, we looked at that FOI and found that, we actually don't have nearly as much as we expect. Another one is that, BC's exports of LNG will reduce global greenhouse gas emissions. And as you saw with David's presentation, that it is also a completely garbage statement. In fact, the government's never produced a shred of evidence to support that claim. Not at all. They just kind of keep throwing it out there and hope no one notices. Just the other day, the Canadian Environmental Assessment Agency released their draft report on the Petronas Pacific Northwest LNG plant. And it was funny, the media coverage of it was like, oh, well, a few minor problems, but no major environmental problems with this. You might have seen that in the Globe and the Sun. So I actually was looking at that report today, preparing for the meeting, because it seemed like they were kind of glossing over some of the detail on greenhouse gas emissions. And the report basically says that this plant, if built, would instantly become one of the largest single point source emitters in Canada. It would increase BC's greenhouse gas emissions by 8.5% just for the plant, up north, and a further 10 to 15% above baseline levels due to the upstream emissions. And that's not even counting the gas that would be burned in Japan or China or wherever the export market is. So, I mean, this is, this is serious amounts of greenhouse gas emissions, and they basically rejected the argument that this is going to reduce greenhouse gas emissions elsewhere. Third myth, that the water impacts from all of this will be minimal. And again, David's research shows that when you drill all these wells, it takes a lot of water. There are risks of that, of water supplies being contaminated. Maybe we don't care about that as much because we don't live up there, and there's not large human populations up there, but there are a lot of living things that do live up there. And even in the absence of that, the water that is used in the fracking process is like permanently contaminated. It's actually removed from the water cycle forever. So these are serious impacts, and the provincial government's response to say, well, if we average that out over the entire northeast region, it's only this very small percentage, neglecting the fact that most of the water actually runs down rivers and in watersheds. So those are the three of the ones, and I already kind of just summarized some of what David already told you. But the two ones that I've been focusing on are the economic claims. That there will be 100,000 permanent jobs coming from BC LNG, and that pursuing this will make BC debt-free. And that claim about debt-free, as well as the claim around greenhouse gas emissions, both were repeated in the throne speech. So it's still part of the arsenal of talking points we see from the provincial government. So what about 100,000 jobs? Well, one of the things I did to try to investigate this claim was I went to the filings that the companies had made, for regulatory filings with the Canadian Environmental Assessment Agency, and I looked and saw what they said. And it turns out that the numbers actually end up being way smaller than you would think. I mean, nowhere close to 100,000. On average, you would look at about maybe 2,000 to 3,000 jobs over a 2 to 3 year construction period. And most of the jobs are in the construction phase. It's very typical for oil and gas. It's very capital intensive. It takes a lot of labor to build the infrastructure itself. But once it's built and up and running, it doesn't actually create that many jobs. So a typical LNG plant, so for some of the larger ones up on the coast, you're looking at about 200 to 300 permanent jobs after that. And you could say, well, there will be some spin-offs in the local community. Maybe for every job created at that plant, there'll be another job created, because of, the additional economic activity at the grocery store or other services that happen. But still, you don't end up with that many jobs. If you think of the Squamish one, which, as David mentioned, is one of the smaller proposals, their estimate, Woodfiber's own estimates, are for 600 person years of employment in the construction phase. So if you average that over 3 years, that's about 200 jobs for construction, but only for those 3 years. And then once it's built, about 100 permanent jobs. It's not 100,000 permanent jobs, 100 permanent jobs. So where does the 100,000 jobs figure come from? Well, the answer is that they made it up. There's a whole paper trail on this. It was, you flash back to early 2013. Premier Christy Clark is tanking in the polls. A young hero of the left, Adrian Dick, basically a party without any vision for the province, latched onto this idea of LNG and turned it into an economic platform and an agenda for the province that I would argue had some success at the polls, but again, largely based on stuff that they just made up. So what did they do? There was a throne speech coming, so this would have been, exactly 3 years ago this week. And what they did was they contracted with some consultants early in January. There's a whole paper trail or email trail and about how they, made this contract, and it was under, quick turnaround to basically come up with this 100,000 number. So first of all, they assume that 5 plants are going to be built. And then literally every stage along the way, they exaggerate the claims. They use an economic modeling approach called input-output models, which are supposed to sort of, reflect what we already know from gross domestic product statistics about the relationships in the economy and how these things actually work. But there's no LNG sector in Canada, so they had to basically make up the numbers for that. And in what got ultimately published by the provincial government, they don't explain any of that. It's all just, hand waving. And so this is basically how they came up with this 100,000 number. I'm not even sure how much we as taxpayers paid for it. Probably a couple $100,000 for the expediency with this consultancy. It got put into the throne speech and then just got repeated ad nauseum during the election campaign. It's just stunning where some of these things come from. Even when you talk about the actual number of jobs in construction or operations, what often gets left out is that these big resource projects use a lot of what they call FIFO workers, fly-in, fly-out workers. So you probably all heard of stories of workers from Newfoundland or even British Columbia going to the Alberta tar sands for stints for a few weeks and then coming back. So they don't actually live and work in that population. Obviously, there are a lot of people say that do it in Fort McMurray. A lot of folks are flying back and forth and they're basically maintaining their family in a different place. And this has been really common in Australia, which has a much larger LNG industry as well. And even during the construction phase, a lot of the companies were expressing concerns that BC didn't have the skilled labor force to construct this stuff anyways, so they were going to have to import workers. So even the jobs that you can bank on, much smaller as they are, aren't necessarily jobs that are going to British Columbians. Yeah. There's a whole bunch of other kind of details around how these modeling exercises work. I'll spare you the details, but if you want to read all the gory details, you can check out our report on the employment aspects of LNG. So what about debt-free BC? This, again, repeated in the throne speech. Another way of framing debt-free BC was this $100 billion prosperity fund. And so where did that come from? Similarly, it was basically made up. I think you could argue that there was some plausibility to it based on the prices of LNG back in 2012 or 2013. What had happened in Asia, if you remember the Fukushima nuclear disaster, tsunami takes out Japan's nuclear facilities, and the whole country basically shuts down its nuclear capacity. So all of a sudden, in order to meet its energy needs, Japan is importing coal, it's importing oil, it's importing LNG, and that pushed the price of LNG up to the heights that David mentioned earlier, about $16. Similarly, Korea was also having a series of scandals to do with the safety certification of its nuclear reactors. So a whole bunch of its nuclear capacity was similarly taken off at the same time. So this is really where that comes from. And since then, as David mentioned, it's no longer profitable to export LNG. If we had a plant built today, up and running, every tanker load going to Asia would be losing money. So the only way that you could build a prosperity fund is if, first of all, the company is profitable. And right now it's not, so it's hard to understand where that's going to come from. If you look at even numbers that are much higher than what are in Asia right now, but would still be profitable, then you get a situation where, yes, there might be some additional incremental revenues to BC, but they're very little. And the track record of British Columbia as a province does not bode well. In the current provincial budget, the amount of royalties we get from LNG, so this is basically the public's payback, as we as the sort of collective owners of the resource below the ground get a portion of the profits from that back in the form of royalties. So those royalties are only forecast to be around $100 million this year. Now $100 million sounds like a lot, and it is for me and for you guys, but in the context of BC's budget, which is $40 billion, it's very, very small. And in the context of the royalty revenues that BC used to get 10 years ago, which was in the $2 to $3 billion range, still very low. And yet, BC's production of natural gas is essentially at record highs. So we're producing more natural gas than we ever have before, and the public is getting back less than it has since like the 1980s. So we're essentially giving away our gas. If you're in the gas business, you know, this works great. If you're a citizen of British Columbia, hoping that that's going to pay for some of your education, your healthcare, or sock it away for a rainy day, then basically you're out of luck. 2 minutes? Few minutes? I mean, there's a whole story in there as well about the LNG tax regime. It's an interesting story about how BC had proposed to tax some of the incremental revenues from this new industry for this prosperity fund. Got huge pushback from industry on that and basically caved just over a year ago. They brought down this rate of this additional LNG tax to a very low level, and then they decided to basically offset that same amount of corporate income taxes. So on balance, it doesn't look like these guys are going to be paying a whole lot of tax in the BC period. And all of this sort of neglects what they call transfer pricing, which is the ability of these big global corporations to shift their cost structures in ways that mean they pay as little tax as possible in certain jurisdictions. So those are the big 5 lies of LNG. Even though none of these have gotten off the ground, it's already having an impact in the Northeast in terms of some of the operations there. The whole Site C dam is basically a project to provide electricity at cheap rates to the fracking industry. And what will happen is that all of the costs associated with building Site C and the transmission lines up into the Northeast all go into the general kitty of expenditures for BC Hydro. So our residential rates and our small businesses will all pay higher in order that these companies are able to access electricity at super low rates. And it's kind of perverse because Site C is hydropower, so it's relatively clean power, and using that to extract a very dirty fuel. Also doing it over the objections of the First Nations. The Treaty 8 First Nations in the area are strongly opposed to this. There's still a legal fight happening in the courts, but the government, through BC Hydro, is already sort of clear-cutting land and trying to make this a fait accompli, so that even if this government loses the next provincial election, that people kind of say it's all going to be done. I'm willing to bet that they're trying to pitch this as well as part of this national climate strategy as a means of how BC can help Alberta get off of its coal-fired power. But it totally runs roughshod over First Nations rights and titles, so that's not going to go away right away. So I guess the final comment on this is, well, why? Why is the provincial government making up this whole narrative and all of these select facts about LNG? Part of it is maybe just the politics of it in terms of it played well with their kind of core messages in the Liberal Party and the need for the Premier to have something to stump on. But I think the real reason is that this is a heist. We're looking at a public resource worth hundreds of billions of dollars, and the government is essentially giving it away, wants to give it away. I mean, the economics of it are the only thing that are playing against it, wants to give it away to these global corporations for 20, 30, 40 years down the road, and damn be the consequences for us as British Columbians. So we find ourselves in this strange state. We're in this sort of post-reality politics where governments don't seem to have any obligation to make arguments based on truth or science. They kind of make it up as they go. But I'm extremely heartened by the fact that you guys are all here tonight. I was like, you guys are holding an LNG event in West Van at a golf course? No one's going to show up to that. And you're all here. So that's the hope in all of this, is that none of this is happening. And as long as we can pack rooms like this and keep the pressure on and work with our allies in First Nations and communities that care about what's happening in their environment and what's happening for our collective kids, then we will win. This isn't going to happen. Thank you.